Hi, thanks so much for having me. One thing that I like to do before I start anything with a big group of people is to take a community breath to kind of center us all. There's a lot of us, so if you'll join me in taking a community breath, you can let all your air out and then take a deep inhale. And then exhale. Thank you. So I'm really honored and privileged to be here with you today to talk about presentation of your work. And when Preet asked me to talk about presenting your work, for me, when I think about this topic, a lot of it I think has to do with the way that you set up your work and the way that you kind of talk about it. So some of it, of course, is the design itself, so the slides that you're showing, the pixels on the screen, but then a lot of the success of presentations I've found is in the way that you kind of frame that work through what you say. So, a little bit about me. Preet kind of covered this in reading my intro, but my background, my bachelor's is in architecture, and right as I graduated, I realized I wanted to work on digital products. So I got a job kind of right after school at a startup, and then worked in startups for a few years, and then for the past 4 years I've been at Adobe. So my experience is like kind of a hybrid of formal training and being self-taught, and a lot of what I'll talk about today is kind of through the lens of my past few works of experience, which is at Adobe, which is a very large company. But I think it applies to kind of any design presentation. Okay, so when you present your work, you are looking for, I think, usually these three things. First of all, you want to get feedback on your work to make it better, right? You're trying to maybe communicate a new pattern, so you've designed something and then you need to sort of socialize it and get it adopted among your team or in other parts of the company, or you're presenting in order to get approval. So I've heard a lot of talk today about being introverted, and I identify as being an introvert, and design in general is like a lot of the work is an introverted process. And so this GIF that's playing is like kind of one way I think to visualize the creative flow as designers. Like for me, one of the best things about my job is when I can put on good music in my headphones and just do the work, and it's me and my screen and my eyeballs. And so a lot of our time is spent in a very introverted way, right? You are working usually by yourself, silently, and then you get your presentation ready. And if you're anything like me, you've worked on it until the very last minute. And then you go into the meeting and you're like, I've got this. I've been working on this for hours and hours and hours. And of course, I'm the best person to talk about my design because I just did it. So you go in there and you have your really perfect slides, and then you're ready to give the presentation, and you're kind of like going through it, and then all of a sudden somebody asks a question that is sort of out of left field, and they're wanting to talk about the color scheme when your presentation is really just about the user journey. And then somebody's manager, or maybe your manager or your boss is like, but why are we even doing this project? And you sort of try to field those questions as best you can, and you leave the meeting and you have your short list of things that you need to address. But there's this feeling of like, that did not go how I wanted it to go. Does that sound familiar? I see some nods. So I've had a lot of crits go that way, and I think that for a lot of those issues, they can really be addressed by how we talk about our work and how we set up that work. So I'm gonna kind of break it down today and give some tips of how to best present your work by talking about how to talk about design. Okay, so there's a few variables in any situation that you're presenting in. The first of which is the audience you're presenting to, right? And then there's the type of feedback that you want. And then there's the stage of the design that you're in. And then this graphic really could be better, but this is the best way I could think of to render the fact that those variables influence the type of context that you give and the fidelity at which you show your work. Okay, so different types of audiences. I'm going to go through all the different variables. So you have your peers, your design peers. I think of this as other people on my team who kind of know the product I'm working on and relatively share the same context. But this could be like your direct partners on a project. And then you have internal stakeholders, so people who are maybe outside of your discipline, like product managers, engineering partners, data scientists, researchers, that are internal, but they're maybe like one step removed from the project. And then you have your bosses, and then you have external clients. I'm actually not going to talk about external clients because I don't really have any agency experience, and so I only want to talk about what I really know. However, I think a lot of this will apply to whatever situation you're in. Okay, different types of feedback. This one's really important. So, sometimes when you're going into a presentation, you want feedback on the workflow, right? You don't want to talk about the visuals. You want to talk about, does this relatively make sense? Can I walk through this, and does this match your assumptions? You who I'm presenting to, does this match your assumptions about what would happen when I clicked this button? And then visual design feedback. This is pretty straightforward. Does this look as good as it can possibly look? Pattern consistency. So this is a big one if you work with any kind of design system, or if you don't. This is about whether the choices that you've made in your design solution match the way that other things work in your product. So a good example of this is there's a lot of ways to, through UI, show a binary choice, right? You can use a toggle, you can use a radio button, you can use a drop-down with 2 options. You can use a checkbox, right? But how have other decisions in your product handled that same question? So do you guys regularly use checkboxes? If so, then a toggle would not be consistent. And then another type of feedback is asking people to help you look for edge cases. Engineering partners are so great for this. They seem to really be able to think through where things will break and where the edge cases are. Okay, so another thing about feedback, I know that this looks like, I'm like, any questions so far? But one thing that I wanted to talk about was when you as a designer, as a person giving a presentation, you have the right to specify whether or not you would like questions kind of as they pop into people's minds as you present, or whether you would like them to be held until the end. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine as someone who is a little bit more introverted, and also just I've seen so many design crits kind of go off the rails because the person isn't able to kind of get through the whole thing. And maybe the question that's being asked will be answered in the next couple of slides. So I think I want to sort of more popularize the practice of specifying whether or not you would like to have questions be held until the end, which means people can just write them down. Or if you're totally fine with like having questions and giving a presentation that's more conversational, that is totally good too, and that's up to you. But I think that this is part of any presentation, is sort of specifying what your preference is. Okay, different design stages. You have your really early exploratory phase, you're just kicking the tires and you're trying to figure out like what the basic workflow is. midway through, where you've maybe done a few iterations, and then the phase where you're like pushing it towards the final, and you are looking to get approval, to get it signed off and really built. And then there's a type of presentation where the work has been approved, but you're kind of, I think Andrew used this terminology, you're doing like a road show, whether that's internal or external. You're showing and kind of socializing the work so that people know that this is a new pattern. Okay, so all of those things will influence the next two things, which are context and type of feedback. So here's different types of context you could give. The first being the user problem, right? This is what we do. We solve problems that people are having. This is almost always a good bit of context to have. The history. So is this brand new work? Is it continuation of existing work? Is it work that is picking up that was maybe dormant because of resources? Dependencies, it's good to call those out. If there's other dependencies of things in the product that your work can't ship until this feature ships, or engineering, like tech stack dependencies. That's good to point out. And then deadlines, of course. So when does this need to be signed off by? Oh, visual fidelity. So you have a couple of options for what fidelity at which to show your work. This one's pretty straightforward: wireframes, mid fidelity, high fidelity. And so here's kind of an illustration of that. You have wireframes. This is an example of like a kind of mid fidelity way that I would present work, and then like full-fledged high fidelity, pixel perfect mockups. Okay, so I'm going to walk through some examples, like mixing up these different variables, and I'm going to use a project that I worked on last year for XD. I don't know if I said that already. I work on a product at Adobe called XD. It's a design tool. And I can talk about this because this is in the public build now. So the project was for adding a feature called responsive resize that basically let people resize groups of elements on Canvas in the design tool the way that you would resize a web browser, right? So prior to this feature, the way it worked is if I wanted to take something and make, maybe let's imagine like a card, a design for a little card, and then resize that from mobile to a tablet size, you take that group and then you maybe have to ungroup it and like move all the things on the right to the right individually and move all the things in the center to the center. And we had a hunch that people by default, other than, there are exceptions of course, but that by default people wanted to resize responsively. So things that are on the left from the beginning, we want them to stay on the left, etc. So what this meant was we were adding UI on Canvas. We needed it to sort of communicate as this was happening that that's what was happening and sort of like give a little bit of UI feedback. And then it meant something new in the toolbar. So that's my fake real example. For running through kind of some examples of these scenarios. Okay, so what if I'm presenting this work in the very early stage and I'm showing it to my peers? This happens all the time, right? I'm gonna sort of gut check this with my other design colleagues. So I'm gonna come on this side. So for this situation, the type of context that I would give is the user problem, and then maybe an abbreviated explanation of the project. If I'm just speaking to my direct peers, they don't need a lot of convincing of why we're doing a certain bit of work. Like they're doing it too, they get it. So here's an example of a screen that I would set up before I presented my work. So we don't need to read through all this, but here, the first bullet is the statement of the user problem. So people want to resize quickly. The second bullet is some history. So it was planned for last year, but it was pushed out. And then the third is just throwing in some fake research statistics. They would be real if I was presenting them. So then I would be really clear about my feedback ask. I need workflow feedback. I don't want to talk about the visual design. I want to talk about if you all who are presenting to think that this relatively meets your expectations. So this is a slide that I would maybe have, or maybe I would just say this before my presentation. I'm looking for workflow feedback. Does this act how you assume it would act? And then for the type of designs shown, I would show 1 to 2 basic workflows. You don't need to show a ton of work to communicate the idea. I would show them at mid or low fidelity with like a few annotations in there. So here is about the amount of work I would show in the early stage to my design peers. And this is like just basically a screenshot. We all work in XD and kind of like present out of XD, which is really convenient. But these are all just slides, right? And my title is at the beginning, and I would just run through these slides. This is about how much work you would need to get the basic idea across. Maybe even less than this, maybe just that first row. And then this is an example of what the content of those slides would be. So you have like your app frame, which is like very hand wavy. It's like, yeah, toolbar, you guys get it. And then high fidelity UI on the canvas, which is where the work I'm proposing lives, and then in the toolbar. And then some basic annotations. What about, though, if it's still that early stage and I'm presenting to a mixed group of people? So it's not just my design peers, I'm presenting maybe to product managers and engineers. This is, I think, a particularly fragile stage to present your work in, and I think it's really important how you frame things, especially in the early stages, because it's easy for people to kind of jump ahead and start commenting on what they see instead of having the conversation that you want to have, which is like high level. Like, does this mostly make sense? Am I on the right track? So, for context, I would say user problem, always good. If you're presenting to a mixed group, it's really helpful to quote any research or user requests. And then, again, any important details about the project history. So this is an example of a slide I would put before the work, just to sort of set it up. User problem, some research, some user voice statistics. I'm not sure if everybody uses user voice. That is a way that at XD we get kind of direct feedback from people. You can go in and request features or upvote features. And product managers look at that and use that as gospel because it's direct information about if our customers want to be using something. So that's really important to be able to speak to the things that the people you're presenting to care about. And then maybe a little bit of history at the end. So here's where you are really clear that this is in the exploration phase. And again, you don't necessarily need to have a slide that says this, but say it. If you're presenting to a mixed group, telling them that this is early work, this is in the exploration phase, and I want feedback on the workflow and maybe if there's any product dependencies. So if I'm presenting and you know that there's another feature coming down the pipeline that will directly affect this, that's stuff you want to know in the early stages. So this is also like very similar to the previous example, but the difference here is, again, being very explicit that this is early work. So the difference here, I would show the same amount of stuff at the same fidelity, but like really stamp everything with WIP, which means work in progress, and FPO if it's any kind of assets that aren't going to be final. FPO means for placement only. So I should have actually put it up in the toolbar to say, like, these aren't the final assets. I don't want to talk about what the icons are. These are for placement only. And then you would have your annotations as well. Cool. So what about if it's kind of midway through the process, you've done several iterations, and you're presenting to that same mixed group of folks? The context you would give is, again, to state the user problem, quote, relevant research, and then this is an appropriate time to talk about any updates since a prior review. So if you're presenting to a group of people that some of them may have seen the work before, then it's really helpful to reference any changes that you've made since the last time they saw it so that they know specifically. So here's kind of a setup slide. Your user problem, your research, and then a note about what I changed. So based on feedback about discoverability, we've moved this higher in the toolbar. It's so jargony, right? But that's a real thing that I've done. Okay, so the feedback that you would request here, this is, it depends, right? But hopefully the basic workflow is ironed out. However, there may be some glaring things that you might want to hear about. This is a good time for visual design feedback, and then knowing about product feasibility. So again, I might not have this as a slide, I might just say this, but you want to get feedback out of this presentation that's helping you move toward a final design. So is this feasible? Hopefully your product and engineering partners in the room can help you know that. And this is where I move into showing really high fidelity work. So this is how XD really looks, and since I'm designing for it, I'm designing XD inside of XD, and I have the real app frame. And so I would show it at this fidelity, at this stage, because I want people to believe and know that the work is closing in on becoming final. Okay, this is a slide that I would not have in my main presentation, but this is actually something that I did a lot when I was just starting out. Where, I don't know if you all do this, but I would go into presentations and I would like run through all the sort of iterations that I had tried, and then I think it was because I was self-conscious about the amount of stuff I had shown, or that I didn't maybe trust my own ability to decide which of those was best. But I can see now that that's kind of a rookie move. People want to know what your best solution is. They're not really interested in the things that you tried unless a question comes up of, here it's like, well, did you try making them all buttons? And you can say, I did, and let me show you some mock-ups of that, and here's why it didn't work. So having kind of like a B-sides, if you can anticipate any questions that are going to come up, is really helpful. But I probably wouldn't have this in my main presentation, just have it on hand. Okay, so sign off presentations, and you're presenting to your bosses. So here, it's important maybe to give the most context, because when I'm presenting to people who are several levels above me, I'm sure they're aware that this work has been done, but they need refreshers on why it's being done and what the problem being solved is. And they're also interested in like the details of technical dependencies and product dependencies. So, what's happening to me too? This is my setup slide where I would have maybe a few bullet points. Because also I learned that bosses love to keep things concise. So like just get in there and say the main things. So your user problem, what the research is. This third bullet is talking about like a product dependency. So this is connected to this other work. And then any technical dependencies. So this part of the work that you see that I've designed, it actually won't come out until later. And then be really clear that you're seeking final sign-off, because even though you're presenting to people in positions of power, they may need reminder, or there may be other people in the room who are seeing the work for the first time. So being explicit that you're seeking sign-off will kind of curb any questions that should have maybe come in the early stage. And then of course you're going to show work at a really high fidelity. And this is like maybe the amount of work I would show when I'm seeking approval. So it's good to still be concise and have your main workflows, but also any leader that you're working with is going to ask really good questions, and you want to be able to have workflows that speak to more details. So this is this is a real screenshot of a presentation deck that I gave for this project. And this is sort of what's on there. It's good. I have found, at least the way things work for me and my company, is that we do these presentations and then we generate like a URL and they can be shared around. And it happens really quickly that someone else wants to see the work and you're not there to present it, you're not able to speak to it. So it's good to have those annotations on the bottom so that they don't get confused if they're seeing it without you being there. And then having the sort of options that you tried just on hand is really helpful if questions come up. So, all of these variables and then what they influence are really important ways to set up your work so that you can have the type of conversation that you want to have. Because as designers, we may not have a person in the room who's facilitating the discussion in a really nice way, so we have to act as our own facilitators. And being really clear in what you say about what type of conversation you want to have will let you have the most successful presentation possible. And it's a really nice thing to do for the people you're presenting to, because we're all thrown into these things together and nobody really knows what they're doing. And so letting your audience know how they can help you is another way to have a really successful presentation. Kind of creating the container and letting everybody exist inside of that. And then, of course, use your best judgment. So all of these things that I've mentioned, they're variables, and they're pretty specific to my experience at like a really large bureaucratic system at Adobe. So the culture where you work may be slightly different. So it's good to identify what the variables are and break them down into what the people you're presenting to need to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ainsley. We have time for 2 questions. The first one is, does it feel weird designing a tool, using the tool you're designing?
That's a really great question. I would say no, it does not feel weird. It feels really natural to kind of reference the way things work currently as you're imagining the way they will work in the future. I think the pitfall of designing the tool within the tool you're designing is that sometimes you can make assumptions about what people understand. So, meaning you can sometimes think that you are your user. And I think probably all of us do that to a certain extent. So that's why it's important to pull in research and to really listen to how your customers are experiencing the app, because you become sort of a power user and you start to assume that everybody knows the things that you know.
The next question, the next most outvoted question is on the lines of something we were discussing at the back, where we were saying quite a few times when you're presenting your work, there would be one such person, and maybe in an agency-client relationship, it could be someone from the client side that's like, well, why did we decide to go down this path? And then, it immediately redirects from the focus. So how do you redirect conversations to the feedback you're seeking if it starts to go off track?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think part of that comes with experience of your particular project. So in the best case scenario, on my best day, one of those questions would come up and you would be able to pretty succinctly speak to why you've made a decision and remember that, and then say, but right now we're talking just high level about the basic workflow. So hopefully, it's really hard to do that as a junior. You hope that there's people in positions of power who have your back and are kind of like watching out for those things and redirecting the conversation, but a lot of times it is just you, and you have to, again, kind of act as your own facilitator, and it can feel hard, especially if you're sort of a people pleaser, to want to give them all the answers. But it's okay to just kind of quickly say, thank you for that question, this is why we did that, and however, right now, we're just talking about this part of the design.
Sounds great. Let's have a big round of applause. Thank you.